Henry Corbett stood beside his snow shelter while his neighbors gathered to watch, their laughter echoing across the frozen valley. 6 weeks later, when the blizzard of 1879 buried the settlement under 20 feet of snow, only one structure remained intact. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1877 arrived in Montana Territory with deceptive gentleness. November brought light snow and tolerable cold. Trappers who had survived previous seasons felt confident. They had their cabins, their firewood, their provisions. Winter was manageable if you prepared correctly and respected the wilderness. Henry Corbett had prepared correctly for 9 consecutive years. Henry was 32 years old that winter, lean and weathered from nearly a decade, trapping beaver and marten in the mountain valleys east of what would later become Helena. He was methodical, careful, and had developed the kind of practical wisdom that kept men alive in country that killed the careless quickly. He had built his cabin 3 years earlier with his partner Robert Hayes, a fellow Kentuckian who had come west in 1872 seeking the same independence and profit that drew men to the fur trade. Their cabin was typical of Montana Territory construction, 20 feet by 16 feet, logs notched at the corners and chinked with moss and clay. The roof was peaked, covered with split shakes and a layer of sod for insulation. A stone fireplace occupied one end. 2 windows with oiled paper let in dim light. The door was solid, pine planks hung on iron hinges. It had sheltered them through 3 winters without significant problems. It seemed entirely adequate. December brought heavier snow. By mid-month, accumulation on the roof reached 2 feet. This was expected. Henry and Robert took turns, climbing up to clear the worst of it, knowing that excessive weight could stress the roof beams. On December 18th, after a night of steady snowfall, Robert went out at dawn to assess the situation. Henry was inside preparing coffee when he heard Robert climbing onto the roof. The crack was loud enough to hear clearly inside the cabin. Henry looked up instinctively. The center roof beam, a pine log 8 inches in diameter that had seemed perfectly strong, had developed a split along its length. The weight of 4 feet of wet snow was more than the wood could bear. Robert had time to shout once before the entire roof section collapsed inward, bringing tons of snow and timber down in a catastrophic failure that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Henry dug frantically, throwing aside broken shakes and snow with his bare hands. He found Robert within minutes. His partner had been killed instantly by a falling beam, his neck broken. The speed of it was almost incomprehensible. A man alive, and competent one moment, dead the next. Killed not by a bear or hostile encounter or any of the dangers trappers feared, but by the simple physics of weight and structural failure. Henry buried Robert 2 days later on a hillside overlooking the valley, breaking frozen ground with an axe and shovel. That night, sleeping in the partially collapsed cabin with canvas stretched over the damaged section, he lay awake thinking about wood and snow and weight and the terrible inadequacy of what men built to protect themselves from winter. Henry could not stay in the damaged cabin. He repaired it enough to be functional, but every time he looked at the patched roof, he saw Robert's death. More than that, he saw the fundamental problem that had killed his partner. Wood was strong, but snow was relentless. Weight accumulated silently, invisibly at night, and structures failed without warning. Spring came slowly to Montana Territory in 1878. As the snow melted, Henry began traveling. He visited other trappers' camps within a 20-mile radius, ostensibly to trade and gather news, but actually to examine their cabins. What he found disturbed him profoundly. Nearly every structure showed signs of roof stress. Sagging beams were common. Several cabins had experienced partial collapses, similar to what had killed Robert. 2 trappers had died that winter from roof failures. Others had survived only through luck. Henry started documenting what he observed. He carried a small notebook and sketched cabin designs, noting roof angles, beam thickness, span distances. He measured snow depths where he could find evidence of maximum accumulation. He talked to men who had survived collapses, asking detailed questions about what had failed and how. Most thought his interest was morbid or strange. Some refused to discuss it. A few shared their experiences, grateful someone was taking the problem seriously. A pattern emerged from his research. Flat roofs accumulated, weight uniformly, but had no way to shed snow. They failed predictably when accumulation exceeded beam strength. Peaked roofs shed some snow but created uneven loading. The valleys between peaks became collection points for massive weight. Steeper peaks shed better but required longer, more vulnerable support beams. Every design had weaknesses. Henry realized something that spring that most men never considered. They built cabins to protect themselves from snow, yet snow destroyed the cabins. The harder they fought against winter with wood and fire, the more vulnerable they became. Every cabin was a temporary fortress, gradually weakening under siege. Roofs rotted from moisture, beams developed invisible cracks, joints loosened from freeze-thaw cycles. Eventually, every wooden structure failed. It was simply a matter of time and accumulated stress. Most trappers accepted this reality. Cabins lasted a few years, then you rebuilt. Men died occasionally from structural failures. This was the cost of living in the mountains. Henry could not accept it. Robert's death had changed something fundamental in how he thought about survival. There had to be a better way. There had to be a method of building that did not fight winter but accommodated it, that used snow's properties instead of resisting them. In late May, Henry made a decision. He would spend the summer researching construction techniques beyond what trappers traditionally knew. He would travel to trading posts where men from different cultures gathered. He would ask questions that might make him seem foolish. He would learn everything possible about building in extreme cold. When next winter came, he would be prepared not just to survive, but to prove something that others thought impossible. Henry left his trap lines in early June, 1878, and rode north toward the Canadian trading posts along the Missouri River. The journey took 2 weeks. He carried minimal supplies, but brought every dollar he had saved from 3 seasons of pelts. Other trappers heading to St. Louis for whiskey and entertainment thought he was going the wrong direction. Henry did not explain his purpose. Fort Benton was the primary trading hub where goods moved between the Montana goldfields and the northern territories. Steamboats brought supplies upriver. Traders from a dozen cultures converged to exchange furs, tools, and information. Henry had been there twice before to sell pelts, but this time he came seeking knowledge instead of profit. He found what he was looking for in a warehouse near the river docks. 3 Inuit men from the far northern coast were trading seal skins and carved ivory. They spoke limited English, but the fort's interpreter, a French-Canadian named Baptiste, helped Henry communicate. He asked about their houses. How did they build them? What materials did they use? How did the structures survive Arctic conditions far worse than Montana winters? The Inuit were initially puzzled by his interest but warmed to his genuine curiosity. One man sketched designs in the dirt with a stick. Dome-shaped structures built entirely from blocks of compressed snow. No wood. No fire except small seal oil lamps. The snow itself provided insulation. The dome shape distributed weight evenly, so additional snowfall made the structure stronger rather than weaker. Henry asked them to repeat this last point 3 times through the interpreter, unable to believe what he was hearing. Other traders watched this interaction with amusement. A mountain man studying savage architecture made no sense to them. Why would someone who had access to timber and iron tools want to build like Arctic natives? Henry ignored their commentary and kept asking questions. How large were the snow blocks? What tools cut them? How long did construction take? What temperature was inside without fire? He spent 3 days at Fort Benton filling his notebook with sketches and measurements converted from Inuit descriptions. He bought a specialized saw with a long, flexible blade designed for cutting snow blocks. The merchant thought he was insane. The saw cost $4, nearly a week's worth of pelts. Henry also purchased a measuring cord, a wooden template for checking angles, and a pamphlet about Arctic exploration that included crude illustrations of snow houses. The Inuit gave him one final piece of advice through Baptiste. The snow must be the right consistency. Too fresh and powdery, it would not hold together. Too old and icy, it would crack when cut. The ideal snow came after a storm when the crystals had bonded, but before the sun melted and refroze the surface. Henry wrote this down carefully, underlining it twice. He returned to his valley in late June and spent the summer in preparation. He rebuilt his damaged cabin properly, knowing he would need it during construction experiments. He gathered and stored extra firewood. He hunted and preserved meat, but mostly he studied his notes and visualized how to adapt Arctic building techniques to Montana conditions. Other trappers noticed his distraction. He was preparing for winter in a way that made no practical sense to them. The first snow of 1878 fell on October 23rd. Henry watched it accumulate with an intensity that would have seemed strange to anyone observing. He was not simply seeing snow. He was seeing building material, studying its consistency and behavior. This first snowfall was too light, too powdery. It would not work. He waited. November brought heavier storms. After the second significant snowfall, Henry went out with his new saw and began cutting experimental blocks. The location he had chosen was a flat area 30 yards from his cabin, elevated slightly to avoid any water accumulation. He had cleared the ground in September, removing rocks and vegetation to create a clean foundation surface. His first attempt at cutting blocks was clumsy. The saw blade caught and twisted. The blocks crumbled at the edges. He had imagined this would be intuitive, but working with snow as a construction material required techniques he had never developed. He spent the entire day cutting and discarding blocks, learning through failure how to angle the saw, how much pressure to apply, how to extract blocks without breaking them. The second day went better. He managed to cut 20 usable blocks, each approximately 3 feet long, 18 inches high, and 8 inches thick. These dimensions came from his notes and calculations. The blocks needed to be large enough to build efficiently, but small enough for one man to handle. He tried stacking them in a simple circle, but without the proper lean angle, they simply formed a vertical wall that had no structural integrity. The third day, his first complete structure collapsed. He had built a circle of blocks leaning inward, attempting the spiral technique the Inuit had described. But his angle was wrong. His blocks were inconsistent sizes, and his understanding of the physics was incomplete. The dome folded inward when he placed the capstone, destroying 4 hours of work in seconds. Henry did not get discouraged. Each failure taught him something specific. Too steep an angle, and the blocks would not support each other during construction. Too shallow, and they would not form a proper dome. The blocks needed to be uniform, not just in external dimensions, but in density. Soft spots created weak points. Hard spots cracked under stress. He discovered the importance of the spiral. If he tried to build in complete circular layers, each layer required a full ring of blocks before he could start the next level. This created distinct horizontal joints that became failure points. But if he built in a continuous spiral, each block rested partially on the block before it and partially on the block below, creating an interlocking structure. By mid-November, he had attempted 7 different structures. 3 collapsed during construction. 2 collapsed hours after completion. 1 lasted 3 days before developing cracks that led to failure. But the 7th structure, built with everything he had learned, stood solid for 2 weeks until he deliberately destroyed it to test its strength. His neighbors watched these experiments with growing amusement. They called it Corbett's Folly. They asked when he planned to actually trap beaver instead of playing in the snow like a child. Henry rarely responded. He was learning principles that no trapper in Montana Territory understood, translating knowledge from one culture into practical application in another. The first week of December 1878 brought the snow Henry had been waiting for. Heavy, wet flakes fell for 2 days, accumulating nearly 3 feet of perfect building material. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees, cold enough to keep the snow stable but warm enough to maintain slight moisture content. Henry tested the consistency by squeezing a handful. It compressed into a solid ball that held its shape. This was what the Inuit had described, This was right. He began construction on December 9th. The foundation circle was 12 feet in diameter, marked with stakes he had placed in October. This size would provide adequate interior space for one person while remaining structurally manageable. Larger domes required more sophisticated engineering. Smaller ones were not worth the construction effort. 12 feet was optimal for his purposes. The first block was critical. It established the spiral pattern that every subsequent block would follow. Henry cut it with precise dimensions, 3 feet long, 18 inches high, 8 inches thick. He had practiced this cut hundreds of times during his experimental phase. The saw moved smoothly through the compressed snow, creating clean edges. He lifted the block carefully and placed it at the starting point of his marked circle. The second block overlapped the first by 6 inches and was positioned with a slight inward lean, 3 degrees of angle measured with the wooden template he had made. This was the key insight he had gained through his failures. The lean had to be gradual and consistent. Too much and the structure became unstable during construction. Too little and it never formed a proper dome. Block after block, the spiral grew. Henry worked methodically, checking each placement with his measuring cord, ensuring the inward lean remained constant. After 20 blocks, the first complete rotation was finished, and he was now building the second level. The blocks rested on 2 points, partially on the block before them in the spiral and partially on the block below them. This created interlocking stability. The work was physically demanding. Each block weighed approximately 40 pounds. Henry cut, lifted, positioned, and adjusted over 100 blocks during the first 3 days of construction. His back ached. His hands were numb despite heavy gloves. But the structure was rising exactly as he had envisioned. By the 5th day, the walls had reached shoulder height. The inward lean was now visible and dramatic. Anyone watching could see this was not simply a circular wall, but a dome emerging from geometric principles. The spiral pattern meant there were no distinct horizontal layers, no obvious weakness points. Every block supported and was supported by the blocks around it. The dome's apex was the most critical point. As the spiral reached the top, the opening became smaller with each rotation. Henry had prepared wooden support braces that he positioned inside the dome to hold the upper blocks in place during final construction. These temporary supports would be removed once the structure was complete and self-supporting. On December 21st, 12 days after beginning construction, Henry placed the final block. It was a custom-cut piece that fit exactly into the remaining opening at the dome's peak. He shaped it carefully, testing the fit 3 times before cementing it in place with packed snow. Then he removed the interior support braces one by one. The dome held perfectly, every block locked in position by the blocks around it. The dome was complete, but Henry's work was far from finished. The entrance required careful engineering to serve multiple critical functions. He began cutting a trench through the snow at ground level, angling it toward the dome's base. This tunnel would be the only access point, and its design was as important as the dome itself. The tunnel entrance faced away from prevailing winds, a detail Henry had planned during his initial site selection. He dug downward first, creating a depression 2 feet below the surrounding snow level, then angled upward as he approached the dome. This created a cold trap. Cold air, being denser than warm air, would sink into the lower section of the tunnel and flow outward. Warm air inside the dome would rise and remain trapped by the dome's shape. The tunnel was deliberately small. Henry cut it just wide enough to crawl through on hands and knees, approximately 2 feet high and 2 feet wide. A larger opening would allow more cold air to enter. A smaller one would be impractical for moving supplies. 2 feet was the compromise between thermal efficiency and functionality. Where the tunnel met the dome, Henry carved the opening through the base blocks carefully. He removed snow in small sections, ensuring he did not compromise the dome's structural integrity. The opening was positioned so that someone entering would rise up into the dome's interior, reinforcing the cold trap principle. Warm air could not flow down and out through an upward-sloping entrance. Inside the dome, Henry shaped the floor and walls with methodical precision. He used a flat wooden blade to smooth the interior surface, removing irregularities and creating a uniform dome shape. This smoothing served two purposes. It eliminated stress concentration points where cracks might develop, and it allowed him to apply water for glazing. The glazing technique came from his Arctic research notes. Using a container of water warmed slightly by his body heat, Henry applied thin layers to the interior surface. The water froze almost immediately in the below-freezing air, creating a layer of clear ice over the compressed snow. He repeated this process section by section over 2 days. The ice layer sealed tiny air gaps, increased structural strength, and created a smooth surface that reflected the dim light from the entrance. He carved a ventilation hole at the dome's apex, approximately 3 inches in diameter. This hole was essential. Without ventilation, carbon dioxide from breathing would accumulate, and moisture from respiration would create condensation that would weaken the structure. The hole was small enough that minimal heat escaped, but large enough for adequate air circulation. Henry built a raised, sleeping platform inside using blocks of compacted snow. The platform was 18 inches high, lifting him above the coldest air that settled at floor level. He carved storage niches into the walls for supplies. He created a small shelf near the entrance for a candle, which would provide light without generating dangerous heat levels. On January 4, 1879, Henry spent his first complete night inside the snow den. Outside temperature was minus 30 degrees. Inside, without any fire, the temperature stabilized at 28 degrees. His body heat alone kept the interior above freezing. January and February of 1879 were unusually mild for Montana Territory. Daytime temperatures rose above freezing several times. Snow accumulated slowly, without the heavy storms that typically defined midwinter. Henry used his snow den regularly, but primarily for cold storage and testing rather than emergency shelter. He kept dried meat and supplies inside, taking advantage of the stable temperature that kept food frozen without the effort of maintaining an ice cellar. The structure performed exactly as his calculations had predicted. Interior temperature remained remarkably stable regardless of exterior conditions. When outside air dropped to minus 40 during clear nights, the dome interior stayed near 25 degrees. When daytime sun warmed the exterior to 35 degrees, the interior temperature barely changed. The thick snow walls and dome shape created thermal mass that resisted temperature fluctuation. Henry discovered additional benefits he had not anticipated. The snow den was absolutely silent inside. The thick walls blocked wind noise completely. Even during storms, the interior was a pocket of perfect quiet. This psychological benefit was significant. Winter's constant wind wore on men's nerves over long months. Having a space of complete silence was unexpectedly valuable. His neighbors' reactions ranged from mockery to concern. Most continued calling it Corbett's folly. They pointed out that the mild winter made his elaborate snow house unnecessary. If he had simply maintained his cabin properly like everyone else, he would have been fine. Some suggested that Robert's death had affected Henry's judgment, that grief had made him obsessed with impractical solutions to problems that did not exist. A few trappers asked genuine questions. Edward Stone, whose cabin was a quarter-mile downriver, stopped by in late January. Stone was older than most trappers, perhaps 45, and had survived 15 Montana winters. He had lost a brother to a roof collapse in 1874 and understood Henry's motivations better than most. He asked about construction techniques, thermal principles, structural integrity. Henry answered every question thoroughly, grateful for someone taking the work seriously. Stone crawled inside the snow den and spent 20 minutes examining the interior. He noted the ice glazing, the ventilation hole, the raised platform, the entrance design. When he emerged, he said only that it was ingenious work and that Henry might be smarter than people gave him credit for. This was the closest thing to validation Henry had received from the community. February brought unusual warming. Temperatures stayed above freezing for 5 consecutive days. Snow melted rapidly. Streams flooded with runoff. Everyone assumed winter was essentially over. By the last week of February, trappers were already planning spring activities, discussing trap lines and where beaver populations might have recovered. The dangerous season seemed finished. Henry was not convinced. He had spent 9 winters in Montana and recognized patterns others missed. The cloud formations moving in from the northwest were wrong. The wind direction had shifted in a way that preceded major storms. The unusual warmth felt temporary, like a pause before something significant. He checked his supplies, reinforced his cabin's temporary roof repairs, and made sure his snow den remained intact. Something was coming. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight on March 2nd. Henry woke to absolute stillness, the peculiar silence that preceded major weather. The sky was gray and featureless, clouds so low they seemed to touch the treetops. He had seen this twice before, and both times had brought blizzards that lasted days. He spent the morning moving essential supplies from his cabin to the snow den. Other trappers noticed the temperature change, but were not concerned. Cold snaps happened. Winter was not quite finished. Most stayed inside their cabins, keeping fires burning, waiting for the weather to pass. Edward Stone stopped by Henry's place around midday and asked if he was worried. Henry said he was preparing, not worrying. Stone looked at the sky, nodded slowly, and went home to secure his own cabin. The snow began falling at dusk, large flakes at first, then smaller, harder crystals, driven by increasing wind. By midnight, visibility was 0. The wind howled with a sound Henry had rarely heard, a sustained roar that penetrated even the thick log walls of his cabin. Snow did not fall so much as fly horizontally, driven by wind that must have been 40 or 50 miles per hour. Henry moved into his snow den on the morning of March 3rd. The cabin was still intact, but the wind was tearing at the roof repairs he had made after Robert's death. The temporary patching would not survive sustained stress. Inside the snow den, the storm was barely perceptible. He could hear a distant wind sound, muffled and abstract, but the structure itself was silent and still. The first day brought 2 feet of snow. The second day brought wind so strong it created drifts 15 feet high in places. Henry's snow den was designed for this. The dome shape caused wind to flow over and around it rather than pushing against flat surfaces. Snow accumulated on top, but the dome's architecture distributed the weight evenly across the entire structure. More weight made it stronger, compressing the blocks together. By the third day, the ventilation hole at the dome's apex was his only connection to the outside world. Snow had completely buried the structure. Henry used a long stick to keep the hole clear, pushing it up through accumulating snow every few hours. Without that hole, carbon dioxide would build to dangerous levels. With it, air circulated adequately despite being buried under tons of snow. On the 4th day, Henry heard a deep groaning sound from the direction of the settlement, then a crack like a gunshot. A roof had failed somewhere. He could not see anything, could not help anyone, could only wait. The storm continued with relentless intensity. The 5th day brought the worst winds yet. Henry's own cabin roof collapsed that afternoon. He heard the crack clearly, even from inside the snow den, a distinct sound of structural failure. The cabin he and Robert had built, that had sheltered them for years, was gone. But Henry was safe in a structure made entirely of the element that had destroyed everything else. The storm continued for 8 full days. Henry lost count of time inside the snow den, marking days by sleep cycles and the dim light that filtered through his ventilation hole. The temperature inside remained stable near 26 degrees. He wore his heavy coat and used wool blankets, but he was never in danger from cold. His breathing kept the small space adequately warm. He had enough dried meat and melted snow for water. Physically, he was surviving easily. Psychologically, being buried alive under 20 feet of snow tested him differently. On the morning of the 9th day, the wind stopped. The sudden silence was startling. Henry waited 2 hours to be certain, then began digging. He pushed his ventilation stick upward and met less resistance than before. Using a wooden shovel he had stored inside, he began excavating upward through the tunnel opening. The snow was packed hard by wind, but not impossibly dense. After 3 hours of work, he broke through to open air. The landscape was unrecognizable. Everything was buried. Trees were visible only as dark lines against white. What had been a settlement of distinct cabins was now a rolling snowfield with occasional collapsed roof sections protruding like broken bones. Henry climbed out and stood on top of his snow den, now invisible beneath him. The structure had survived completely intact under massive weight that had destroyed everything built from wood. He began checking on neighbors. The Henderson cabin had collapsed entirely. The family had escaped but lost everything and were now crowded into the Miller cabin a quarter-mile away. The Prescott brothers' cabin had a partially collapsed roof but was still marginally habitable. 6 other structures showed serious damage. 2 had collapsed completely. Henry's own cabin was destroyed. The roof beams snapped, the interior filled with snow. Edward Stone's cabin had survived structurally, but barely. The roof had held, but stress cracks ran along support beams. Stone's wife and 2 children were terrified, convinced the roof would collapse at any moment. Stone himself was trying to reinforce beams from inside when Henry arrived. One look told Henry the cabin was dangerously unstable. Any additional snow load would cause catastrophic failure. Henry offered his snow den. Stone was reluctant at first, pride preventing him from abandoning his own structure. But his wife made the decision. She gathered the children and essential supplies. Henry led them back through snow that was chest-deep in places. He showed them how to crawl through the entrance tunnel, how to arrange themselves on the sleeping platform, how the ventilation worked. The Stone family spent 3 days living in the snow den while Edward worked to repair his cabin with help from other trappers. They witnessed firsthand what Henry had built: the stable temperature without fire, the complete wind protection, the structural integrity despite being buried. The children, initially frightened by the strangeness of it, gradually became comfortable. Stone's wife told Henry it was the warmest she had been since the storm started. Their cabin had required constant fire feeding, constant smoke, constant worry. The snow den simply worked. Spring arrived late in 1879. The settlement spent March and April digging out and rebuilding. 12 cabins required major repairs or complete reconstruction. 2 trappers had died during the storm, caught outside trying to reach neighbors when visibility dropped to 0. The financial losses were staggering: destroyed food supplies, damaged equipment, ruined furs. The storm of '79 became the benchmark against which all future Montana winters would be measured. No one mocked Henry's snow den anymore. The structure that had been Corbett's Folly was now simply called Brilliant. Trappers asked detailed questions about construction techniques. How did he cut the blocks? What was the proper lean angle? How did the ventilation system work? Why did the dome shape matter? Henry answered every question with the same patience he had shown Edward Stone, explaining thermal principles and structural engineering in terms practical men could understand. By October 1879, 3 other trappers had built their own snow dens. Edward Stone constructed one adjacent to his repaired cabin, refusing to trust wood alone after what he had witnessed. 2 younger trappers built smaller versions as emergency shelters. The constructions were imperfect, lacking Henry's precision and experience, but they followed the essential principles: dome shape, proper entrance design, adequate ventilation, ice glazing for strength. Word spread beyond the immediate settlement. Trappers traveling through the region heard about the snow, houses that had survived the great storm. Some were skeptical until they saw the structures themselves or talked to people who had lived in them. Others immediately grasped the implications and returned to their own territories, determined to learn the technique. By 1881, variations of Henry's design existed in settlements across northern Montana and southern Canada. The technique acquired a name through organic usage. People called them Corbett shelters, Corbett snow dens, or simply built Corbett style. Henry never claimed ownership or tried to profit from his innovation. He shared knowledge freely with anyone interested enough to ask. His motivation had never been recognition. It had been survival, and then, after surviving, helping others survive. Henry continued trapping until 1885, when declining beaver populations and changing markets made the profession unprofitable. He moved to a small homestead near Great Falls, married a widow with 2 children, and lived quietly. He built a proper timber house, but always maintained a small snow den during winter months. Old habits and hard-learned knowledge did not disappear simply because circumstances changed. Montana historians estimate that Corbett-style snow shelters saved between 20 and 30 lives over the following 2 decades. The exact number is impossible to verify because survival rarely generates written records. But accounts from the 1880s and 90s include multiple references to people surviving extreme storms, specifically because they had built proper snow shelters that could withstand conditions that destroyed conventional cabins. Henry Corbett died in 1903 at age 60. His obituary in the Great Falls newspaper made brief mention of his trapping years but said nothing about snow dens or frontier innovation. To most people, he was simply an old trapper who had outlived his era. But in the mountains, among people who understood winter, his name remained attached to a technique that proved knowledge could be more valuable than strength.